Hey guys, CJ here. Today we're getting back to this, the Budget Threadripper build. If you remember from the last video, I did a quick components overview as well as did just a slight modification to this Land Cool 2 by just removing all the metal panels that came with the case, cutting down a couple of the pre-installed standoffs, and then adding some of my own standoffs so we could install this sheet of acrylic. Now I've done a little bit more work to this acrylic sheet, and I'll take you through exactly what I've done, what we're gonna do to turn this into a cable management panel. Okay, here's the sheet of acrylic I mounted to the back of the case in part one of this build. I've done a little more work to it by drilling the holes for the wires to pass through the 24-pin ATX, the 6 and the 8-pin PCIe power, and the two 8-pin EPS power supplies. I've also added the frosted light bars to the edges. I made these by simply cutting strips of 9mm acrylic, and I used 220 grit sandpaper to sand the clear acrylic and give it a frosted look, and then cemented the strips to the acrylic panel using solvent acrylic cement. Now on the back side of these, I cut a channel, a groove, I don't know, a slot, where I'll add a custom cut RGB strip all the way around the edge. The frosted acrylic will diffuse the light and hopefully provide a nice soft glow inside the space. Now today, I need to add the strip to the bottom of the panel. But before I can do that, I need to drill the holes where all the wires will pass through down to the bottom to the power supply. I just need to figure out exactly where those holes are gonna be. And to do this, I'm gonna plan the routes of all of these cables. Now the PCIe or the GPU power supply is pretty easy, and although I'm using solid copper wire for this, which I can bend in multiple different directions very easily, this one's just gonna pass through, bend 90 degrees and come straight down, and I'll explain why that is in a bit. Now the 24-pin will come through and kind of make a sweeping arc down to the bottom, so let me get that planned out. And I'm just using some cheap 14 gauge wire to plan the path with the farthest inside and outside cables. The final cables I'll construct with some really good quality 16 gauge wire, which I'll be custom sleeving. Now to do this, I'm just gonna place the wire in the first hole, kind of get a good length, and a second piece of wire here. And to ensure I get the proper spacing, I'm just using these cheap plastic cable combs. That way I don't have to run all 24 wires, or at least all 12 wires. I can just run a single, my inside and my outside. And I'll say I want it to come about there, and that'll be the first pivot point where it starts to pivot. And we'll say right about there and there. So I'll just mark each of these locations. All right, now that I have that marked, what I can do is just follow this straight down. That's where I'll pass through my bottom. And these pivot points here is where I'll actually cement in these acrylic pieces, which will become cable guides. I'll cut each one to size, and then I'll drill the holes through, and they'll cement right in place, and the cables will pass through. All right, let me take my bottom. Okay, now for the EPS cables. And now I could come straight down like I did for the PCIe cables, but that's kind of boring. So maybe what I want to do is kind of like a double sweep or double bend, so they come down and run right alongside my ATX cables. Yeah. So let me get that marked out. And that about does it. Now, the reason why I just went straight down with the PCIe wires is because between these wires and the 24-pin ATX wires, I need to cut a 2-inch slot right about here for 3 SATA data cables. And because standard flat cables don't like to bend in a nice smooth way, I actually ordered some round SATA data cables. However, I couldn't find any sleeved round cables. So if I can't get those SATA cables to look good on the outside of the panel, I actually have some room between the panel and the case itself. So I'll just route those and hide them behind the panel, which is why I haven't cut that slot yet. But that's it. Everything is marked out. Now I need to go cut, drill, cement, and then prime and paint this panel. That'll take me a while, but luckily thanks to video editing, I'll just add some cool transition that represents the passing of time. And so it's 2 days later, and worse than that, I didn't even finish everything I said I was gonna do. I'll get to the what and why of all that in a sec, but first, I wanna make a few points on taking on the task of doing a case customization like this. I'm not really calling it a case mod, as the only real modification I did to the case is cut off a couple of standoffs, and honestly, I could have just as easily drilled a couple of holes in the acrylic panel for those to pass through. So, first point, a customization like this doesn't have to be very expensive. For this project, I spent a grand total of $80. There's about $20 worth of acrylic, a $15 can of acrylic cement, under 20 bucks for all the wires and cable sleeving, and another 25 for the connectors and pins and such. Also, you don't need a big workshop with a bunch of fancy expensive tools. I scored and snapped a 1/4-inch acrylic sheet with a simple razor. I cut the 9mm acrylic on my very cheap table saw. I drilled out the holes with a cordless hand drill, just using a cable comb as a guide. And I smoothed and shaped the pieces by hand with varying grits of sandpaper. The second point is, it's okay to hope for perfection, but don't necessarily demand it from yourself. Some mistakes are okay. You see here that some sections of my acrylic basically broke out while drilling them, and some of the holes are essentially joined, which is fine because it'll all still work as intended by holding the wires in place, and once all the wires are installed, you won't be able to see the gaps. There are times when you do need to start over, but not every mistake is a project killer. And finally, have some patience, which brings me back to the reasons that this whole thing isn't completed to the degree I planned. First, the SATA cables I expected 2 days ago haven't arrived yet, so I can't prime and paint the panel, as I may need to drill out a few more holes and mount another acrylic cable guide or two. The solvent cement doesn't work once I paint the panel. But I haven't been just sitting around waiting on the UPS man to bring me my cables. In the meantime, I did move the stock case fans to the front and positioned them back a bit. I also installed 3 Lian Li Borlight 120mm fans on the top and rear of the case. I rerouted all the front panel cables and test fit the panel. Everything was working, so now it was time to run a few wires to get the general length of my custom cables. Which I was able to do in between helping out my kids with their tech-related issues. Now it was time to tackle the most consuming part of the project and actually make each of the 54 custom sleeved wires I needed to power the system. That's when I discovered problem number 2. I ordered everything I needed for this project weeks ago. And with the exception of the SATA cables, I had everything on hand ready to go, or so I thought. The custom cables I'm making are essentially cable extensions as opposed to full cables, so they're not power supply specific. To make those cables, I need male pins on one side of the wire where the PSU cable will plug in, and female pins on the other side will plug into the motherboard or GPU. I ordered a lot of each and thought I'd receive both because there were 2 bags of ATX pins in the package I received, but upon closer inspection, I discovered that both bags contain male pins. Now, I'm not going to call out the company because honestly, I've been ordering my custom cable stuff from them for years and I've never had any problems. And I should have inventoried my stuff better before starting. After all, proper planning prevents piss poor performance, right? But besides the female pins, I had everything else I needed, so I went to work creating the custom wires. If you're interested in how all these tools work and how exactly I'm making these cables, you can check out my How to Rewire a Computer Case series, where I provide a full tutorial on all of this. And that's where we are now. This is the point where I was going to show you how to route each individual wire to create a perfectly presented cable. The cables here are just for presentation purposes, so I didn't have just a blank panel on camera for you guys. I mostly wanted to show you how I use the solid wire to form a really unique PSU cable, but unfortunately there isn't anywhere I can just run out close by and pick up some female ATX terminal pins. So that's where we'll leave it today. I'll pick it up right here at this point in the next part where I should be able to finish the entire build and get her up and running. So make sure you get subscribed so you don't miss that. If you liked what I presented today, please hit that like icon on your way out and maybe check out some of my other videos. As always, my goal is to teach, so I hope you learned something today. Hope to see you next time. Until then, I'm CJ and you have a great week.